Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, July 3rd in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humani ingeni est odiesse cum laesaris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. The president is talking peace with the leader of North Korea and is preparing to do so with Russian President Putin. But American liberals are appalled that peace might break out because the profits of America's 1% depend on U.S. government threats of war against Russia and China as a way of maintaining U.S. economic control of the world. Defense stocks declined sharply after the Singapore summit, as you might have noticed. So the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, an international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is try to encourage our fellow citizens to become aware of the killing our government is doing around the world in our name. We're involved in great crimes, and we should stop. Aware conducts demonstrations each month in downtown Champaign on the first Saturday from 2 to 4 p.m., the corner of Main and Neal Streets. You're invited to join this anti-war demonstration if you want to. And the flyer that will be distributed at this Saturday's demonstration is entitled, "Israel is pushing the U.S. to go to war with Iran. We shouldn't let it happen." 15 years ago, the U.S. government attacked Iraq and killed 1 million people on the basis of lies that Iraq had dangerous weapons of mass destruction. During the presidential campaign, Donald Trump talked of his opposition to the attack on Iraq. Quote, he said, "Look at the war in Iraq and the mess we're in. I would never have handled it that way. What was the purpose of this whole thing? Hundreds and hundreds of young people killed. And what about the people coming back with no arms and legs? Not to mention the other side, all those Iraqi kids who've been blown to pieces. And it turns out that all of the reasons for the war were blatantly wrong. All this for nothing," close quote. That's Donald Trump during the presidential campaign. A principal instigator of that shameful U.S. war against Iraq was the government of Israel, who wished to remove Iraq as a regional rival in the Middle East. Now Israel is trying to repeat that crime, urging the U.S. to attack and kill Iranians, even as Israeli snipers shoot unarmed demonstrators and children in Gaza. But the U.S. is part of a deal with Iran and 6 other countries that guarantees that Iran will not develop even one nuclear weapon. The U.S. has thousands of nuclear weapons. Israel has at least 200. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the Iran Nuclear Deal, is an international agreement reached in 2015 between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union. The President has now announced that the U.S. will go back on its word and violate the deal. The Israeli government cheers because they want the U.S. to attack Iran for their benefit. To get the war started, Israel has attacked Iranian troops in Syria, who are there legally, unlike U.S. and Israeli forces, who are there illegally. An Israeli government advisor has all but admitted that killing Iranians in Syria is designed to provoke an open war with Iran. We should not let the Trump administration be manipulated into war by Israel or anyone else. The President and our congressional representatives should be urged to remember the lessons of Iraq and not attack Iran, among other things, a more populous and better armed country with powerful allies, notably Russia and China. War with Iran risks a larger, even a nuclear war. The largest anti-war demonstrations in history occurred around the world before the U.S. attacked Iraq in 2003. As Americans, we must do even more to prevent this new criminal war. If the U.S. and Israel attack Iran, there should be general work stoppages, strikes, and street demonstrations across the U.S. In the meantime, write the President and your congressional representatives. The addresses are on the AWARE Facebook page. The U.S. has been torturing Iran for 65 years, with a U.S.-sponsored coup in 1953, a U.S.-sponsored dictator, the Shah, and then a U.S.-sponsored war with Iraq. The U.S. continues to torture Iran today. The paramount goal of U.S. foreign policy for generations has been to prevent the economic unification of Eurasia, which would reduce the ability of the U.S. 1% to exploit Eurasia. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, as well as subsequent U.S. wars in East and Southeast Asia, Korea, and Vietnam. See the open door policy in 1899, where the U.S. was already working to prevent other imperialist countries to dominate Eurasia. The great reversal of this U.S. policy occurred in 1949, when the Chinese Revolution accomplished the exclusion of the United States from China. The U.S. has never forgiven China for that. U.S. control of the Mideast has as its paramount goal the control of U.S. oil flows, which the Pentagon calls offshore control of China. Hence the contest, by the way, for the South China Sea, the ornament of Hillary Clinton's state secretaryship. The U.S. demand for world control of oil is directed towards Eurasia and particularly towards China. The problem, of course, is that Russia is a major producer of oil, and oil politics in this sense are difficult for the U.S. to manage and manipulate into its century-long control of Eurasia. The U.S. should, of course, withdraw its troops and weapons from the Mideast, close the 1,000 U.S. bases ringing Russia and China. Russia, by the way, has a dozen foreign bases. China has one. The U.S. should cooperate with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Association of Eurasian Countries, and the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese economic expansion that means to produce greater trade between Eurasia and the rest of the world. Instead of what the U.S. actually does, a present policy of war provocations against Russia and China, from Ukraine, where the U.S. engineered a coup, to the South China Sea, where the U.S. wants to control the ability of China to communicate with the rest of the world, to trade with the rest of the world. The U.S. is willing to kill a lot of people to prevent the development of Iran and Iraq, Syria and Afghanistan outside of U.S. control. And the Democrats and Democratic front groups support that policy. The JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, was an attempt to establish that control, the carrot to match the stick. the Democrats in Congress could insist that this administration observe that deal and cut off funding, military funding, until they do. But the Democrats are not doing that. Their support for the democratically negotiated nuclear deal is very thin. Russia's defense of Syria against the Obama administration's murderous attempt at regime change there seems to have been successful. That is, the regime change that the Obama administration tried to produce in Syria has not worked and doesn't seem to be working. It's hard to imagine, though, that the Russian defense of the situation in Syria that Russia would not do the same for Iran, with the possibility of a much larger war if the American and Israeli attempt to overthrow the regime in Damascus would look like succeeding. It's the task of the anti-war movement in the United States to expose the pro-war machinations of the Democrats and the other elements of the war party, perhaps particularly of the soi-disant Democrat progressives. As Bruce Dixon notes, Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist too, just with an imperialist foreign policy. The Democrats support the attempts to construct the war provocations against Russia and China that the last administration did and the current administration is being bullied into doing. Since World War II, Russia and China have been at the heart of U.S. foreign policy, and perhaps earlier has been described by the classic work of Helen Mackinder. The paramount concern of the U.S. has been that no peer competitor, in Zbigniew-Brzezinski's phrase, arises in Eurasia. That is, any power that's willing to compete with the United States for economic control of the rest of the world. In the 70 years since the end of World War II, the U.S. has killed more than 20 million people in wars designed to maintain the global economic hegemony that the U.S. obtained as the only undamaged major country in World War II. George Kennan, the foreign policy guru and head of the Pentagon's policy planning group in the 1940s, George Kennan pointed out in a top-secret State Department memo written in 1948, quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction," close quote. Now, that was the American establishment's view in the years after the Second World War. We have now had more than 2 generations of the U.S. attempting to enforce this, from Korea to Vietnam to Latin America, and the result has been literally millions of dead people. This is what the U.S. has done in the post-war world. 50 years ago, after the 1967 war that destroyed secular Arab nationalism, the U.S. adopted Israel as our stationary aircraft carrier in the Mideast in order to use the control of energy flows out of the Persian Gulf as a weapon against our economic rivals from Germany to China. 40 years ago, the U.S. gathered Muslim radicals, armed them, and sent them into Afghanistan before the Russian invasion in order to destroy Russian influence in what's been called Pipelinistan, that area of the Middle East in which oil is extracted. I will put an article on the Aware website, the Aware Facebook page about the construction of jihadism by the United States during the Carter administration. These events, 40 years ago and 50 years ago, were bracketed by the U.S. coup against the government of Iran, the elected government of Iran, in 1953, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq 50 years later in 2003. International crimes, the leaders of which would have been hanged, the U.S. leaders of which would have been hanged if the Nuremberg rules were applied. So today, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa. We remain, as Martin Luther King said long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today for the profits of the U.S. 1%. Many American liberals display a partisan taint, as it's been called, in their acceptance of the Democratic Party's account of foreign relations, including Russiagate. As Bruce Dixon points out, Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist, too, just with an imperialist foreign policy. That's not only wrong but dangerous, and it undermines the dismantling of the last administration's war provocations against Russia and China, from Ukraine to the South China Sea. Perhaps it's easier to see away from the U.S. media miasma. The Australian journalist and filmmaker John Pilger wrote before the presidential election, quote, "The CIA has demanded Trump not be elected. Pentagon generals have demanded he not be elected. The pro-war New York Times, taking a breather from its relentless low-rent Putin smears, demands that he not be elected. Something is up. These tribunes of perpetual war are terrified that the multi-billion-dollar business of war, by which the United States maintains its dominance, will be undermined if Trump does a deal with Russian President Putin and then with China's President Xi Jinping. Their panic at the possibility of the world's great power talking peace, however unlikely, would be the blackest farce were the issues not so dire." Close quote. That's John Pilger seeing more clearly than most Americans what was going on in the last election. Senator Durbin, our senior senator, was one of the signatories of a letter to Vice President Pence. That letter, too, will be posted on the Aware Facebook page last week, which shows how deep and dangerous this taint is, that is, what the Democrats are doing. The anti-war movement, the letter is an amazing assertion of the American war provocations that now appear under the term Russiagate, and that Durbin has adopted this completely and uncritically is nothing less than shocking. The anti-war movement needs to resist these Democrats and their sympathizers. 10 Democratic Party senators issued a reprehensible call for the Trump administration to demand that the Ecuadorian government, that was the letter from Durbin and friends, that the Ecuadorian government renege on this political asylum it provided WikiLeaks editor Julian Assange 6 years ago and evict him from its London embassy, where he's been essentially a prisoner for those 6 years. He would then be detained by British police while U.S. agencies filed extradition warrants. That's the reason that Assange can't leave the Ecuadorian embassy, the suppression of WikiLeaks by the United States. The letter of the senators was addressed to Vice President Mike Pence ahead of his visit to Ecuador, going on currently, and top-level talks with the small country's presidents, Lenin Moreno. The signatories are a roll call of leading congressional Democrats: Robert Menendez, Dick Durbin, Richard Blumenthal, Edward Markey, Michael Bennet, Christopher Coons, Joe Manchin, Jean Shaheen, Dianne Feinstein, and Mark Warner. The document, the letter, exudes deceit and the hatred of the American ruling class for Assange, a journalist who has exposed the criminality of U.S. imperialism and the real goings-on within its corridors of power, including within the Democratic Party. The letter declares that those Democratic senators, led by Durbin, are extremely concerned that Ecuador still provides asylum to Assange. It states they are alarmed that the readout of Pence's visit to Ecuador did not mention the WikiLeaks editor. The letter declares, quote, "It's imperative that you raise U.S. concerns with President Moreno about Ecuador's continued support for Mr. Assange at a time when WikiLeaks continues its efforts to undermine democratic processes globally," close quote. What they mean by that is WikiLeaks publishes accounts of American war crimes and the issues that the American government doesn't want to see in the press. By democratic processes, the Democratic senators mean the ability of U.S. imperialism to wage illegal wars of aggression, to use the most criminal and predatory means to shore up the fortunes of a tiny layer of billionaire oligarchs, to intrigue and manipulate the political affairs of other countries, and to treat the American and international working class as nothing more than fodder for exploitation. The Democrats repeat the slanderous accusation that has been leveled against Assange to pave the way for his extradition in the United States and trial on charges of espionage, that WikiLeaks was a partner in purported Russian intelligence interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. The Russian interference allegation has been exploited since late 2016 by the combined forces of U.S. intelligence agencies, the Democratic Party, and publications such as the Washington Post and the New York Times to push American politics even further towards dictatorial forms of rule. It's been used to pressure Internet companies such as Google and Facebook to impose sweeping censorship of independent media organizations. Unsubstantiated and even absurd allegations of ties between the Trump campaign and Russia have been at the center of a concerted political civil war to pressure the White House into maintaining a bellicose American foreign policy against Moscow, with all the danger it poses of triggering a war between nuclear-armed states. The letter of the Democratic senators relies exclusively on a report issued by the U.S. intelligence agencies to vilify Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. A declassified version of that report was published on January 6, 2017. In a sweeping conspiracy theory, the CIA, FBI, and NSA portrayed the 2016 publication by WikiLeaks of emails and documents from the Democratic National Committee, real emails and documents from the Democratic National Committee, and then emails sent by top Democratic Party figure John Podesta, as the product of a nefarious Russian plot to undermine Hillary Clinton and assist the victory of Donald Trump by saying what the Democrats were actually talking about and actually doing. WikiLeaks does not divulge the source of the leaks it publishes. That is why whistleblowers around the world have trusted it to make available some of the most historically explosive exposures of government and corporate criminality. Julian Assange has nevertheless publicly stated, in response to the immense anti-democratic implication of the frenzy over Russian interference, that the source of the DNC and Podesta leaks, Democratic National Committee and Chairman Podesta's leaks, was not Russian intelligence. On December 14, 2016, Craig Murray, a former British diplomat, whistleblower, independent media blogger, and associate of WikiLeaks, told the Daily Mail, the London newspaper, that he knew the source of the DNC and Podesta leaks. He revealed that he had met with an intermediary for disgruntled members of the Democratic Party in Washington in September of 2016. Murray stated, quote, "Neither of the leaks came from the Russians. The source had legal access to the information. The documents came from inside leaks, not hacks." The leakers, he stated, wanted to expose, quote, "the corruption of the Clinton Foundation and the tilting of the primary election playing field against Bernie Sanders." Murray told the Daily Mail, "I don't understand why the CIA would say the information came from Russian hackers when they must know that isn't true. Regardless of whether the Russians hacked into the DNC, the documents WikiLeaks published did not come from that." There's suggestion, of course, that the source was Seth Rich, the murdered Democratic National Committee staffer who was killed in Washington, and his murder immediately dismissed as a property crime. It may not have been. The American state, however, along with its political and media servants, does not allow the truth to stand in the way of pursuing its strategic and economic interests. The letter of the Democratic senators invokes the characterization of WikiLeaks made in April 2017 by Mike Pompeo, then CIA director and now U.S. Secretary of State. Pompeo declared that the media organization was, quote, "a non-state hostile intelligence service often abetted by state actors like Russia," close quote. The Democratic National Committee has taken the vilification of Assange even further in the civil lawsuit it filed on April 20th, 2018. Without a shred of supporting evidence, the Democratic National Committee made the sweeping assertion, quote, "WikiLeaks and Assange directed, induced, urged, and or encouraged Russia and the GRU, Russia's Secret Service, to engage in this conduct and or to provide WikiLeaks and Assange with DNC's trade secrets, with the expectation that WikiLeaks and Assange would disseminate those secrets and increase the Trump's campaign chance of winning the election," close quote. Interesting claim, this by the DNC. If people find out we're cheating, they'll vote for the other guy. Interesting comment. The claims of Pompeo and the DNC have only one motive. They're intended to establish a political atmosphere in which Julian Assange can be forced from the embassy in London and detained on allegations of being essentially a foreign spy or a form of non-state unlawful enemy combatant, the charge laid against alleged members of the al-Qaeda terrorist organization. Such charges are designed to block any defense based on constitutional, legal rights and protections of freedom of speech. A large number of self-styled left and liberal media publications, political organizations, and individuals, notably Democrats, have seized upon the claims of the U.S. intelligence agencies and the Democratic parties to justify abandoning any defense of Assange, WikiLeaks, and freedom of speech. They've joined with the U.S. state and now label Julian Assange as a Russian agent, a known Kremlin asset, or as one particularly foul individual stated, Putin's bitch. All those who repeat the slander of Assange, or remain silent as it's ramped up, are assisting the U.S. state apparatus in a far-reaching and ominous assault on fundamental democratic rights. And at the head of the list right now is our own senior senator, Senator Durbin. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We're talking about the war-making of the United States around the world and the political machinations that stand behind it. We have a crack researcher in Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, who has sent us some of the following comments on the week's news. He refers to the Poor People's Campaign, which has been very slightly covered in mainstream media. Dr. No points out that the best account of it you might hear on American television at the moment comes, or in America at the moment, not on American television, comes from the YouTube program Redacted Tonight, the best of the comedy news shows available today, he says, and I think he's right, on the new Poor People's Campaign. Perhaps the greatest threat Dr. Martin Luther King posed was uniting the poor regardless of identity politics categories, race, sex, sexual orientation, etc. And the new Poor People's Campaign is getting to some of that good work. The Real News coverage, the Real News Network coverage Articles often include transcripts and pointers to YouTube-hosted videos is also good. Mainstream corporate media will have none of this debate, virtually zero coverage to be found there, which is not surprising. Another criticism I'm just not buying, writes Dr. No, is the notion of limited funding to do what we want done. The U.S. military can't account, in other words, that we can't do the social programs we need in this country or the aid we need to refugees and whatnot, because we haven't got the money. The U.S. military can't account for trillions of dollars every year, as we pointed to in stories that get virtually zero mainstream news coverage. That means we can afford anything we want, and establishing many useful rights, homes for all, Medicare for all, potable water for all, jobs for all who are willing to work, and universal basic income as well, nutritious and tasty food for all, and more. Plenty of war criminality in U.S. recent past. No need to look at President Obama as an exception. He's a war criminal too. The program The World According to Jesse Ventura, Brigida Santos, and others, on 9/11 and the war criminals who get war reception now, is people like G.W. Bush, Gina Haspel, the new head of the CIA, and others. Obama's subsequent administration's choice to not prosecute for war crimes, and President Trump's pledge to continue torture such as waterboarding and worse, are all covered in Jesse Ventura's program. Also, more on this is an interview with author George Grundy. Grundy seems to be evaluating the past along the lines of a personality contest instead of what actually occurred. When talking, a personality contest between Obama and Trump, and talking about whether waterboarding is torture, of course it is, here's the discussion. You can find that on that website. I'll put that also on the Aware Facebook page, where Jesse Ventura claims to have been waterboarded when he was educated as a Navy SEAL, says, indeed, it is torture. And he speaks as someone who was a competitive swimmer. When people are trying to put this out now that waterboarding is not torture, that's nonsense. And now, more to the point, it's up to the discretion of the president to determine whether we're a country that tortures or not. What does that make us look like internationally now? The elevation of one of the CIA's torturers to the headship of the CIA does not inspire confidence. Let us remember that Obama's principal tool of war making was the drone war. He sharply increased drone killing over Bush's administration, and that means many thousands of extrajudicial assassinations, including Americans and children, such as the Awlakis, adult father Anwar, and his 16-year-old minor son Abdulrahman, both American citizens. Obama also left that for his successor, just as it left for him, which Trump now has that power in using it, including using a drone-led raid in which Navy SEALs killed Anwar al-Awlaki's 8-year-old daughter. Glenn Greenwald's report, Obama killed a 16-year-old American in Yemen, Trump just killed his 8-year-old sister, as we're seeing for an account of those activities that the Democrats want to hide. It would be good to take off the rose-colored glasses when looking back at Obama's administration. He's a war criminal who should be in irons in The Hague awaiting trial alongside G.W. Bush and Donald Trump. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the news that doesn't make it into mainstream American news. An interesting example is the details of the Skripal affair in Britain. Skripal affair refers to the supposed poisoning of an ex-Russian spy and his daughter in the cathedral town of Salisbury in southern England. Boris Johnson, the comical and vicious foreign minister in the current British government, wanted the OPCW, the lab that ostensibly identified a Russian nerve agent as being involved in the Skripal affair, to have the power to assign blame for the chemical attacks, and he got his way. Russia is still being, they've assigned the attacks to the Russians, of course, the Russians who did it. Russia is still being kept out of the investigation, fake as the British investigation is, as Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has repeatedly pointed out. The shift in OPCW power only helps the UK further behave in a manner which makes it look like they're hiding evidence and blaming Russia without cause. The only deaths involved in this case, which is said to revolve around an oh-so-lethal nerve agents, were Skripal's pets, all of which the UK government reportedly killed and cremated. It's not clear quite why they killed them, make it impossible to judge whether they have been affected by the poison, which may or may not have existed, or whether it's just because the British kept the Skripal's house closed and locked, and the pets died in the house. This isn't clear. The UK government is also reportedly buying Skripal's house and everything in it. This also might have already happened with the house of the policeman who found the Skripal slumped over in Salisbury Park. Russia's also being left out of the investigation, much to their dismay, and despite what Yulia Skripal, the daughter of the spy, is a Russian citizen. There isn't yet enough evidence to definitely conclude that the UK is hiding something. Suspicions are great, but significant choices they're making are indistinguishable from what one would expect if the UK were hiding and destroying evidence in order to push a lie aimed at pushing Russiagate lies. It certainly looks that way, and the more one reads about the circumstances of the event, the more plausible that seems. There are no signs of stopping the Russiagate nonsense being spread abroad by the American political establishment. Fake news, CNN's ratings, are now falling below the Food Channel and staying well below Fox and MSNBC. This is very interesting. In some ways, CNN, the Clinton News Network, has been the major pusher of the Russiagate nonsense, and people are turning it off. People aren't listening. Fox and MSNBC, condemned as supporters of Trump and the right wing, so to speak, in fact, are doing very nicely, thank you. In April 2018, CNN, the Russiagate network, fell to number 11 overall for cable news in primetime. Fox and MSNBC were the top two channels in the same ranking at that time. Now CNN is number 13, while Fox and MSNBC held their positions. What does this mean? What are Americans hearing in this? Fox has been number 1 for 24 weeks, with 2.5 million primetime cable viewers. CNN has under 1 million viewers. This leads wise academics at places like Harvard right now, I have a particular work in mind, writing articles and even books saying, you know, democracy is getting out of hand. We can't have this sort of thing going on when people are going to be informed by something other than reliable news networks, and therefore we have to think about other ways in which we can cut down both on the news and on the democratic reaction, lowercase d, of Americans who hear this sort of news. The last time we had concerns like this was the late 60s and early 70s, when American business felt that the anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, was beginning to realize that it was American business which was behind the war in Southeast Asia, and therefore its political effects had to be considered and indeed opposed. This was put forward by think tanks like the Trilateral Commission and a classic work called The Crisis of Democracy, the crisis being that there was too much democracy around and something must be done. And what was done, of course, was the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. There's another aspect of the activities of the government on Dr. No's list of concerns from this last week. Did NSA, the National Security Agency, become trustworthy? No. NSA claims they're deleting improperly collected call data, text messages and phone records, what the NSA calls call data records, dating back to 2015. NSA is deleting the call data records, they claim, because several months ago NSA analysts noted technical irregularities in some data received from telecommunications service providers. These irregularities also resulted in the production to NSA of some CDRs that NSA was not authorized to receive. Because it was infeasible to identify and isolate properly produced data, NSA concluded that it should not use any of the CDRs. Close quote. Yeah, the NSA, a U.S. government agency that has built a massive data and storage processing facility in Utah, hidden what they're doing until multiple leakers and whistleblowers told us about some of what they were doing, Snowden, for example, built secret surveillance networks in other countries, from Ethiopia to Australia, kept secret their role in the extrajudicial assassination program. According to a former drone operator for the military's Joint Special Operations Command, who also worked with the NSA, the agency often identifies targets for people that the American drones are to kill, based on controversial metadata analysis and cell phone tracking technologies. Rather than confirming a target's identity with operatives or informants on the ground, the CIA or the U.S. military then orders a strike based on the activity and location of the mobile phone a person is believed to be using. And also, the NSA lied to Congress. Representative James Clapper famously lied to Congress in 2013 about what the NSA was and was doing, collecting surveillance on millions of Americans, yet avoided serious punishment like prison time for what some call perjury. Lying to Congress would seem to constitute perjury, particularly on a vital matter like this. The NSA is now, the National Security Agency is now implicitly asking us to believe them when they say they're deleting what they consider improperly collected data. I would not have believed the NSA would call any data that they collect to be improperly collected, nor declare that any data they can collect is data they are, quote, not authorized to collect. Nor would I believe they're actually deleting anything, writes Dr. No. Finally, we should make a reference to the freedom of speech. A recently aired segment from RT on how white supremacy propaganda is increasing, with scare talk about white supremacist speaking on college campuses. The piece also accepts and uses the term hate speech, a term that has no legal definition in the U.S. Attempts to define the term in state policy is called unconstitutional. In Nadine Strausser's book, Defending Pornography, I believe she'll cover this topic more in her upcoming book, Hate Speech, due to be published soon. There is a concerted effort now to ban political speech under these circumstances. One wonders if recent actions against RT itself have been forgotten. RT had its capital credentials pulled. It was called names in an attempt to malign RT by associating it with Russian propaganda. RT is the broadcasting network that relates to Russia the way the BBC relates to the UK, or France 2 does to France, a national broadcasting system, a national news network. RT's own story from December 4th, 2017, on a professor who wants to revisit the Americans of independence versus being colonized, is another reminder that RT has done better on this basis in the recent past. The issue here is discussed in terms of the pros and cons of the argument that he puts forward. We should note that RT should be attended to in parallel with the BBC and American mainstream media for what Paul Harvey used to call the rest of the story. When the freedom of speech issues are brought up, Dr. No reminds us of Noam Chomsky's comment from many years ago, quote, "If you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like." Goebbels was in favor of free speech for views he liked, the propaganda minister for the Nazi regime. So was Stalin. If you're in favor of free speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech for precisely the views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of free speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech, and you can decide which position you want, close quote. There's a concerted effort right now to convince Americans about the dangers of free speech. We have a series of clips from Noam Chomsky on these issues. Will also be on the Aware on the Air Facebook page, or the Aware Facebook page. If you look for that Facebook page, look for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort Champaign-Urbana. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we have a few minutes left to consider some other issues. And I'm going to begin with a piece from a news group called Eurasia Future. The piece is the most detailed account I've seen about the relations as they exist right now before the Trump-Putin meeting on the 16th of July, the relations as they exist right now between Russia, Israel, and the United States in regard to Iran. Both Russia and the United States, and Israel as well, as an American cadet, are interested in what is going on in Iran. Very interesting, very interested. And it will be part, undoubtedly, of the discussions between Trump and Putin. Russia's official policy regarding the presence of foreign troops in Syria remains consistent. Now that Moscow believes its limited mandate to fight, neutralize, and contain Takfiri terrorists, that is jihadi radical Islamic terrorist elements, has been fulfilled, key Russian officials have stated that all foreign troops, including those in Syria at the request of the government in Damascus, must also begin a withdrawal process from the country. On the 30th of May, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated, quote, "As regards the confrontation between Israel and Iran in Syria, we have agreements on the southwestern de-escalation zone area within Syria. These agreements have been reached between Russia, the United States, and Jordan. Israel was informed about them as we were working on them. These agreements stipulate that this de-escalation zone should consolidate stability, while all non-Syrian forces must be withdrawn from this area, and I think that this should happen as soon as possible," close quote. Lavrov's statements followed on from one issued by Moscow's special envoy to Syria, Alexander Lavrentiev, who in no uncertain terms said that Russia's aim for a foreign troop withdrawal from Syria includes both Iranian and Hezbollah personnel. This Hezbollah is the military operation based in Lebanon. This follows on from a phone call between Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and his Israeli counterpart Avigdor Lieberman. Or according to an official press release from Russia, the following was discussed during the conversation. Lieberman and Shoigu have discussed the situation in Syria, in particular, the developments in the south of the country, as well as Iran's attempts to establish a foothold in Syrian territory, close quote. In adopting Washington and Tel Aviv's language regarding Iranian, quote, attempts to establish a foothold in Syria, Moscow is clearly sending a message that its desire for an Iranian withdrawal is now as much of a priority as it is for the U.S. and its Israeli ally. At around the same time that Shoigu and Lieberman discussed matters regarding an Iranian withdrawal, hawkish U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton said the following after returning from a meeting in Moscow with the Russian president, which itself solidified the forthcoming summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to be held in Helsinki in 2 weeks. Quote, "We'll see what happens when the two of them get together. There are possibilities for doing a larger negotiation on helping to get Iranian forces out of Syria and back into Iran, which be a significant step forward to have an agreement with Russia if that's possible." That's John Bolton, the American National Security Advisor, talking about what will be an issue at the summit meeting between Trump and Putin. When asked his views on regime change in Syria, Bolton appeared to grudgingly admit that this is no longer a feasible goal. He stated, quote, "Well, I don't think Assad, the president of Syria, is the strategic issue. I think Iran is the strategic issue," close quote. What these statements mean for Syria and foreign combatants in this country is an issue. Taken in totality, it now seems obvious that the U.S., Russia, and Syria are all on the same page regarding the desire to achieve an Iranian and Hezbollah withdrawal from Syria, while likewise each side has, in very different ways, arrived at a point where so long as Iran and Hezbollah withdraw, attempts to remove Syrian President Bashar al-Assad from power will be dropped so far as Washington and Tel Aviv are concerned. If that's true, it'll be interesting to see. In this sense, while Washington and Tel Aviv have conceded defeat in their attempts to remove the Syrian president from power, if this is true, Russia is now willing to work with Trump and Netanyahu with the aim of overseeing an orderly Iranian and Hezbollah withdrawal from Syria. This means that Russia and Iran have clearly reached an impasse in respect of their short and medium-term strategy for Syria. While Russia has tacitly supported Turkey's anti-Kurdish Operation Olive Branch in northern Syria, and with the U.S. beginning to cooperate with Ankara, the Turkish capital, with the disarming of the Syrian branch of the PKK and the Turks in Manbij, the town in northern Syria, the presence of Iranian personnel in Syria has become the biggest stumbling block toward a final settlement in the country between the major international parties to the conflict. He's talking about Russia and the U.S. and their relationship to Syria. Seeing as Turkey and the U.S. are in a sometimes hostile and more recently friendly game of cat and mouse over influence in northern Syria, it seems self-evident that if the U.S. withdraws from northern Syria, Turkey would eventually follow in line with its commitments in the Astana format, that is, the agreement reached under Russian encouragement in discussion among the parties. In any case, the presence of Turkey in the U.S. and northern Syria is realistically no longer a major concern for Russia, nor is it for Israel, in spite of Tel Aviv's worsening relationships with Ankara. That certainly is an optimistic reading, and it may even be true. While some reports have suggested the U.S. may offer to withdraw from northern Syria in exchange for Russian guarantees to work with Tel Aviv to foment an orderly Iranian and Hezbollah withdrawal, such reports are less indicative of a still unlikely rapid U.S. withdrawal, but are instead indicative of just how much unanimity there is between the U.S., Russia, and Israel regarding the status of Iran and its non-Syrian allies in the conflict. As for the option of Damascus itself, it is now a simple matter of choosing to work with its Russian partner over a long-term peace strategy, or say no thanks to a strongest partner and instead opt for the adoption of Iran's strategy, by which is meant the presence of Iran within Syria. The suggestion is that the Russian and American agreements, which are ongoing and will continue in the Helsinki summit, in fact end the American attempt to overthrow the Syrian government, if that's true, and end the presence of Iranian forces and Hezbollah forces within Syria. This is a consummation devoutly to be wished. It's not at all clear that that will be the outcome, but it's the arrangement among the major powers, Russia and the United States, that should be attended to. Remember, the whole thing began with the U.S. attempt to bring in jihadists and overthrow the government of Syria. If Russia entered Syria at the request of the Damascus government, it was to counter the attempt to overthrow that government that the U.S. was supporting. If the U.S. and Russia now agree on an arrangement for Syria, then the possibility of a war including Iran is lessened, and one can hope that this is an outcome of the Helsinki summit that would be as positive in its way as what appears to be the outcome of the Singapore summit. The American political establishment is chewing the scenery over this issue. They're appalled that the general policy of American war provocations east and west of Eurasia seem to be falling apart. You've been watching Aware on the Air. This has been our attempt to talk about the news that does not make it into the mainstream media, particularly about the war-making by the American government. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. And this was recorded on the 3rd of July in the 27th week of 2018. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, along with articles referred to tonight. Thanks also to Awareist Karen Aram. UPTV will soon cablecast a talk by Medea Benjamin given here in Champaign entitled Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. U.S. relations with Iran have been fraught for decades, but under the Trump administration's tensions are rising to startling levels, says Medea Benjamin, one of the best-known 21st century peace activists who offers the incredible history of how a probable alliance became a bitter antagonism. It's the theme we've been talking about tonight, and if you hear Miss Benjamin's talk, you might compare and contrast it with some of the things that we have been able to say this evening. There is an open AWARE meeting this coming Sunday, 5 to 6 p.m., at the Hammerhead Coffee Shop at University Avenue and Wright Street in Campustown. Members and friends of AWARE are welcome to attend, and if you're interested in anti-war week and our anti-war work in our local community, you're invited as well. Don't forget AWARE's anti-war demonstration this Saturday, 2 to 4 p.m. at Main and Neal Streets in downtown Champaign. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the American government, particularly our liberal Democrat Senator Durbin. The 4th of July celebrations tomorrow remind us of a speech Frederick Douglass, born a slave, gave in 1852, entitled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July? America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future." This is 1852 now. "Your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants brass-fronted impudence, i.e. lies, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him, to the slave, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. That's an ex-slave talking about slavery in 1852. And this is Carl Estabrook for members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.